Hello comrades, it's Comrade Reese here, and today I'm just going to be talking about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as it is something that people tend to misunderstand quite a lot. The Soviet Union was a massive superpower. It was a socialist workers' state. The Soviet Union operated on something called the dictatorship of the proletariat, which means democracy for the working class, combined with the violent suppression of the overthrown capitalist class. The reason why the Soviet state was democratic for the working class was because the interests of the working people were represented by the various bodies of the state. The people of the Soviet Union basically had an exceptionally high level of involvement in the running of the country via Soviets or workers' councils, for those who don't know, trade unions, factory committees, farm committees, school committees, neighborhood committees, etc. However, the Soviet Union was dictatorial towards the former ruling class, who never gave up on their bid to restore the old, backward, exploitative and brutal order. The Soviet Union was established by the great comrade Lenin, the man who developed the theory of Marxism-Leninism by studying Marxism, analysing capitalism enough to know that imperialism is its highest stage, and also analysing the different organisational tactics that you would find within a communist party, namely democratic centralism and vanguardism. I have made a video about Marxism-Leninism, so if you want to go and check it out, you'll find a link to it in the description of this video. So, Comrade Lenin developed this theory of Marxism-Leninism, and this theory was later put into practice in the Soviet Union by Joseph Stalin, another one of the architects of socialism. Stalin constructed socialism in the Soviet Union after the country was able to deter 14 imperialist invasions during the Russian Civil War, which happened between 1918 and 1921. It was waged by all of the imperialist countries, together in league with the Tsarist White Guard, along with the support of the Mensheviks. Now, Stalin wanted to industrialize the Soviet Union and modernize it due to the threat that the imperialist powers were becoming to the country. And believe it or not, he was frighteningly correct, because what happened in 1941? Nazi Germany had invaded and attacked the Soviet Union. But why was the Soviet Union able to kick the Nazis right up the arse and pretty much bitch slap Hitler? Well, you may hear academics coming up with all sorts of confusing scenarios to try and denounce the Soviet Union. However, if you look hard enough, you would come to realise that the main reasons why the Soviet Union was very successful during the Second World War was the fact that the Soviet Union had built itself into a modern country with a high level of culture, with healthcare, education and housing being accessible to the workers. And a state came into being which, strictly speaking, wasn't really a state in the formal meaning of the word, as the exploited 90% were ruling over the exploiting 10%. Essentially, in the Soviet Union, the workers were the state. They were in control. All of this was done within a period of about 20 years. You know, if that's what a backwards country can do within a period of 20 years, then imagine what countries like Britain, France, the United States and so forth could do in 10 years if the working people of those countries could just do one thing: get rid of the parasites who rule over those countries. The second reason for the Soviet Union being successful in the Second World War was because out of all of the Allied forces, and what I mean by the Allied forces are Britain, France, the United States and the Soviet Union, the best generals were actually in the Soviet Red Army. Socialism had transformed the Soviet Union into a modern superpower that the Western imperialist countries were absolutely terrified of. The reason why the Western imperialist countries kind of backed off when the USSR was around was because the Soviet Union didn't just support socialist struggles across the world, the Soviet Union also supported anti-imperialist struggles all around the world. To explain it better for those who are not too savvy with history, when the United States or any other imperialist country wanted to invade a country or take over another country's resources, utilise another country's cheap labour and take over their markets, or if the imperialist countries wanted to bomb another country for the sake of domination. The Soviet Union pretty much was the country you really didn't want to mess with. The Soviet Union basically made a stance against the West, saying, if you want to take over this anti-imperialist country, or this socialist country, you've got to go through me first. So, socialism in the Soviet Union didn't just liberate the people of Russia and Eastern Europe, it also gave hope to the oppressed people all over the world. Hell, the Soviet Union even went to war with the United States in order to help Korea in the 50s. Hence the reason why the Soviet Union was the pride and joy of the working class everywhere. It is also the reason why so many communists became absolutely demoralized when the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991. Also, if you look at it further, just as the Soviet Union was being dissolved in 1991, the United States had launched the first Gulf War in Iraq. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Western imperialist countries basically went on a fucking killing spree in countries like Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya and Syria. Why did they do this, you ask? Well, the answer is pretty simple. The Soviet Union was not around to protect and support these anti-imperialist countries anymore. So the bourgeoisie kind of feels that they can now kick the boot in. And not just in the socialist and the anti-imperialist countries, but also at home in the imperialist countries too. Because after the Second World War, the Soviet Union had liberated Eastern Europe and Central Europe from the Nazis. And this forced the Western European countries in particular to start giving concessions to the working people. Why? It was because the red banner of Marx, Engels and the banner of Lenin was fluttering, not just on top of the Kremlin in Moscow, but also in the capital cities of Central and Eastern Europe. This led the bourgeoisie to basically think, holy shit, we better start giving the workers some concessions, otherwise the workers are going to end up following the example of the Soviet Union by overthrowing us and taking what they need instead. Some of these concessions included the National Health Service in Britain. Now in my country, the post-war Labour government is very famous for establishing the NHS, but it is rightly hated in other countries as they repressed and oppressed the peoples of Malaya, Korea, and went to town on anti-imperialist struggles. So, even though the Soviet Union did strike fear into the bourgeoisie of the Western European countries, a lot of the money to pay for those concessions came from imperialism and colonialism too, particularly the concessions that were given to British workers, because the British Empire enslaved most of the fucking world. As you can see, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was not just bad for the working people of Russia and Eastern Europe, it was also bad for the people of the oppressed countries and also for the working people at home in the imperialist countries. Okay, now let's get on to the point of why I decided to upload this video in the first place. A lot of people who don't really understand socialism would tell you that it doesn't work or that it's a failed system. In particular, people would throw the argument of, oh well, the Soviet Union collapsed, so that means that socialism doesn't even work. But to believe that would just make you very ignorant, as the Soviet Union was actually dissolved. There was an official decree signed by the Soviet government in 1991 to dismantle the Soviet Union. Secondly, the Soviet Union was not destroyed by socialism. Socialism is what transformed the Soviet Union into a modern superpower. The Soviet Union was not destroyed by imperialism either, because imperialism would quite frankly be no match for the Soviet Red Army in any battlefield. Of course, Western intervention, such as sanctions, did contribute to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but if the Western imperialist countries had tried to invade the Soviet Union like they did when it was building its very early foundations just after the Great October Socialist Revolution, then they would have been met with a fierce resistance from the Soviet Red Army. In fact, there's an old saying that goes a little something like this: it is much easier to capture a fortress from the inside. Now that is exactly what happened to the Soviet Union. It was not destroyed by imperialism, it was not destroyed by socialism. It was destroyed by opportunism and revisionism within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. First of all, let me just briefly explain what revisionism means for people who don't really know. Revisionism basically means to change Marxism-Leninism under either a false pretense or to deliberately change it with no pretense whatsoever to serve the interests of the capitalist class. Revisionism is pretty much changing Marxism-Leninism in a very bad way, or even completely abandoning it to either serve the capitalist class or to restore capitalism in a socialist country. Now, there's nothing wrong with implementing and establishing Marxism-Leninism in a different way to one country. That's completely fine. But it's when you change or abandon the basic tenets of Marxism-Leninism to a point where capitalism is actually being restored, that is revisionism. This is what happened in the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin in 1953 and the stepping down of Malenkov in 1955. The Khrushchevite revisionists within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union actually managed to bring down the Soviet Union over a period of 35 years by restoring capitalism bit by bit. Whether people like it or not, Nikita Khrushchev was not a man who strived for bigger and better things. Nikita Khrushchev was responsible for splitting the international communist movement because he was an extremely manipulative opportunist who sent the Soviet Union on the downhill path. In the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, two very important things happened. Khrushchev denounced Stalin and he put forward new policies that went against the basic tenets of Marxism-Leninism. Now, the attack on Stalin and the policies abandoning the basic tenets of Marxism-Leninism are quite connected, because when Khrushchev denounced Stalin, he did portray personal feelings of hatred towards Stalin, but that factor is not very important. What is very important is what Stalin actually stood for. He was a Marxist-Leninist. He put Lenin's theory of Marxism-Leninism into practice in the Soviet Union. But Nikita Khrushchev completely abandoned that, and the Western imperialist countries kind of started buddying up with Khrushchev in a way, as the imperialists had tremendous faith in Khrushchev, and they greeted Khrushchev's speech with great warmth. Why was this the case? Well, when Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union, he was pretty strict, and what I mean by that was that anybody who was in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who was anti-socialist or revisionist, would be purged. Now, a lot of people tend to think that Stalin's purges were executions and death squads, but the word purge doesn't necessarily mean to execute someone. What Stalin did was that he cleaned the house. He caught the opportunists, revisionists, and the anti-socialists within the party, removed them from their positions of power, and kicked them out of the party. However, what Khrushchev did was that he started letting in a shit ton of liberals and revisionists into the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and he also allowed them to the position of power that allowed them to govern the country. This then leads me to Brezhnev. When Brezhnev was the leader of the Soviet Union, the country experienced a period called the Era of Stagnation. This was because the Kosygin reforms had been implemented in the 1960s, in which the means of production that were previously owned by the working people began getting privatized, so things like agricultural equipment, factories and so forth. So when you combine the restoration of capitalism with heavy sanctions by the United States, the Soviet Union was in a pretty bad place, as the economy became pretty stagnant by the 1970s. This stagnation got even worse under Gorbachev, as he implemented many liberal economic reforms, which were met with even more sanctions by the United States. During the Gorbachev era, it got to the point where the Soviet Union had a policy of food rationing, which then led to food shortages and economic instability in the Soviet Union. All of this was because of Nikita Khrushchev's reforms and the opportunists and the revisionists who were let into the party by Khrushchev, who, instead of trying to safeguard the Soviet Union, just dissolved it. Now, there was a referendum held in the Soviet Union in 1991 in which 75% of Soviet citizens actually voted for the Soviet regime, but it was taken away from them. Even today, a vast majority of the population of the Russian Federation, around 65%, actually want the Soviet Union to be restored. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the very first president of the country that we now know as the Russian Federation came to power, and his name was Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin is probably one of the most hated politicians throughout Russia, as he is the most famous for mass privatizations of different companies like Yukos, which was an oil and gas company that was worth around $5 billion, but it was actually privatized and sold for $310 million. Another oil company that was privatized was called Sibneft, and this company was worth around $3 billion, so a little bit less than Yukos, but Sibneft was privatized and sold for around $100 million. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was so profitable for capitalists all over the world, as the former Soviet state assets were being sold for a significantly less amount than what they were really worth. Not only this, but when the Soviet Union was dissolved, the average life expectancy of the Russian population had begun decreasing, and some comrades from Russia tell me now that this drop in life expectancy can still be seen today. Basically, all of the safety nets and securities that people had in the former Soviet Union had completely disappeared in favour of the capitalist system that had been restored. Therefore, it is no wonder that there were riots in Moscow in 1993 against Boris Yeltsin's bourgeois dictatorship over the Russian people. And it is no wonder that more than half of the Russian population want the Soviet Union to be restored.